study session to order on January the 14th at 5:30 p.m. Before you, you have the agenda for tonight's meeting. Are there any changes that you would like to make to the agenda for this evening?
Mayor Crow, I just have a quick question. In reference to changing to regular council agenda, I wanted to ask, with the redevelopment agreement that's on the agenda for tonight, can we ask for discussion on that, even though it's just the first reading, or how does it work?
The discussion would actually come at the next meeting. This is just the introduction of. I think, though, if you have questions, my guess is any member of council can ask questions probably about any time they want to. So, I mean, I think you have the right to ask questions tonight. Typically, we ask them for the second and third reading, but I think that's just that's more of a protocol than it is a rule.
Right,
so I think tonight, if you have questions, I think we'd probably rather get the questions sooner rather than later.
Okay.
Is that right?
Should I mention the amended ordinance on wireless?
Yeah, I think.
Okay. Go ahead.
This is
Not on the redevelopment agreement. There's another item when you're ready.
On the regular agenda?
Regular
you
agenda.
You want to amend the agenda or what?
It's basically, it's a clarification. There will be an amendment. Bill number 9376, there are a few minor non-substantive changes recommended by special counsel, and council has a memo explaining that, but just when that item's called, I'll be able to present on it.
Anything else? Hearing no other change, is there a motion to approve the agenda for tonight? Made by Ms. Carr. Is there a second? Was I supposed to tell you to turn that on? Second by Mr. Hales. Any discussion? Hearing none, those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you very much. Mr. Rose.
Honorable Mayor, council members, tonight we are intending to introduce or provide you with information on the really the final results of our class and compensation study, as well as get some indication from you as it relates to the percentile that you want the staff to be placed within. I am certainly moving towards a recommendation of the 75th percentile. We do not have an ordinance on your regular agenda tonight, but my intention would be, unless I get different direction, to place an ordinance on your January 28th agenda that would place the employees at the 75th percentile. But we are presenting the options for the 50th percentile and the 65th percentile, just so that you can understand what those costs would look like. But with saying that, I will turn things over to our Human Resources Director, Yolanda Housey, to introduce.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I, in turn, will turn things over to Joe Rice and Taylor Sprague of the CBiz Consultants, and they will go ahead and present the results of the compensation and classification study.
Hello? Yep. Good evening. It's good to be back. It's been a few months since we last addressed this group. The first portion of tonight's presentation, the first 20 pages, you've seen before. The tense has changed, right? So instead of saying that we will do something, it says that we've completed that work. Based on the time for tonight, really want to focus on the results and the findings of the study. But if there's any questions, we can dig into that, or if there's anything we need to reference back to, we might flip back to some pages. But just for time, we're going to focus, starting on page 22, and focus on the results of the study. And I guess just to provide a quick recap. Sorry, it looks like there's some, is that fine? Yep. A quick recap. So, we started on this project a few months ago to analyze and review compensation, make sure that it's market competitive. As a part of that process, we have survey data as a consulting firm that we use, where we compare the job descriptions, the job content. So employees completed a job analysis questionnaire. We're looking at the survey data to understand how those two things compare. along with a lot of other things. And so today is really to bring you up to speed on what we found. Starting on page 22 of the compensation study results, we have a high-level chart. So this compares our findings. I'm getting some stares. Everybody, we're good? You can't hear me? Okay, I can. Is this better? Yeah. Okay. On page 22, we have the high-level results of our findings where we're comparing pay within the city to market data. So on the horizontal axis here, we have market-based salary at the 75th percentile, and on the vertical axis, we have pay within the city. So each of the blue dots is a job. So if you pick a dot and draw a line down, that's where the job is paid at the market 75th percentile. And if you take that same dot and you draw a line to the left, that's where it's paid within the city. Each gold dot is the market data. That's a job plotted against itself. And then we add two trend lines so that we can see, within the city how changes in the market translate to changes in pay internally. And what this helps understand at a high level, when you look back, that pay starts competitive, but as you move up the structure, that competitiveness starts to lag. And so it's really a matter of scale of how far above or below. But when we look at the market 75th percentile, this chart is showing that internal pay lags that benchmark. The next page then, it's a similar chart, but we look at total cash compensation. So that is the sum of base pay and any variable pay. So, that's a bonus or an incentive, which isn't common in, municipalities. There's some challenges to doing that. But for some of the positions, as we looked at broader market data, if it's a job in IT, accounting, HR, in other organizations and private organizations, there may be some incentive eligibility tied to that. I forgot about the clicker. Okay. All right. Thank you. So this just says that because with the city, base pay is the same as total cash compensation, there's some variable pay in the market that by that measure, the lag increases just a little bit. On page 24 then, we have the last chart of its kind where we're looking at total compensation. So this includes benefits. So we went through a benefits valuation process where we looked at the medical benefits, which we capture as a fixed amount per employee, and then retirement and paid time off, where we looked at that as a variable amount based on salary to come up with a benefits valuation. So this chart would show that the benefits we show is greater than the market. So it closes some of that gap to this market 75th trend line, but it's not enough to close that difference. So this is just kind of high level positions compared to the market.
Are the benefits, just curious, the healthcare, the time off, which one? Or is
we have a slide.
The driver? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a slide looking at that a little later. So after we completed the market analysis, then we had to evaluate the salary structures. And so as we looked, we developed 4 different pay structures. The first 3 are step-based, in line with what you have today. So for what we're calling general, and then police and fire, we have a step system where it's comprised of grades with a minimum, midpoint, and maximum, but then that's segmented into specific steps that, based on anniversary or other milestones, the employee automatically moves from one step in the salary grade to the next. And then we have a force structure for the executive, which we have as open ranges. So that's not tied to an automatic increase with each year of service. to share the details on page 26, this is what we have for the general structure. So you'll see that we have a series of grades, and then you can follow the steps going across. And so what we've modeled is a structure that has 5% going from one step in the structure to the next. And then all the way to the right, you can see the midpoint differential. So that's one of the tools that we have in designing the salary structures. That is, we look at any organization, we try to understand what's the hierarchy, what's the level of positions. Is it highly structured where it's, they have levels 1 through 5 for a specific job. In that case, we would have to have very small midpoint differentials to allow for that continued progression. Other organizations might have really wide positions where that midpoint differential could be pretty wide. This is pretty typical of what we would see. So when we look at the market data, jobs are going to slot into this structure based on the relationship between that market 75th percentile and the range midpoint. And so it's a simple rounding exercise. We're trying to find the closest relationship between the market data and the salary structure. So then jobs slot into the structure based on market. Each grade then is comprised of jobs with a similar market value. Okay. The next structure is for police. Our approach is slightly different when we design structures for public safety. So it's still predominant to have a step-based system with public safety for various different reasons. And with that, it's important to be competitive at that entry-level pay. So there tends to not be variability that you're going to come in above that step 1 pay. So here we dug in a little bit more and looked at the participating organizations to understand what is their structure entry point, and we've designed this structure to match those numbers. Again, with 5% steps between each, 5% between each step, and then the number of steps varies based on that range spread, so how wide that range is from the minimum to the maximum. Okay. We followed a similar process for the fire structure, again looking at the structure minimums and maximums between those peer organizations, and a similar design with the number of steps and then 5% step adjustments. And then the last structure is for executives. That's where we have the open ranges. So we have the minimum, midpoint, and maximums. Those really establish the benchmarks for competitive entry-level pay and appropriate max-out pay, but it's not a rigid system saying, where based on their years of experience they should fall within that structure. There's more flexibility within that. Okay. Starting on page 30, we show that classification. So I mentioned the process of looking at the market data and then finding that relationship with the salary structure. So for the general classification, we have that list that, for grade 3 or, for grade 8, all the positions that slot into grade 8 within each grade. So it's just the results of that slotting process. Again, relationship between the market data and that structure midpoint. That's a good point. And so, one of the steps prior to this that we conducted was internal equity. So we matched and shared our preliminary results with the acknowledgement that the market data is as good as anybody's, but there's always some challenges. There might be internal equity relationships that you value that our market data might have broke. And so there was some feedback where a position would move down to maintain that internal equity or move up to maintain that equity. We worked through those internally. So this classification continues on slide 31, which completes the general structure. We then have the police classification. So we do have some additional job titles within there that just want to highlight. and then the fire department. And then the last of those structures on slide 34, we have the executive classification. So based on our review, this is where these are the positions that fall in that executive classification, as well as the grade assignment. I have a series of more charts for you following that. So we're going to look at a series of charts that, based on current pay and those salary structure parameters that we looked at. So, in each of these charts, you'll see the gold bars on the left and the right. Those represent the salary range minimum and maximum. And we have the grade listed in the center there. Each green dot here represents one employee, and it's slotted based on their pay and where their current salary is within that salary range spectrum. So you can see on the left, there's a handful of jobs, a number of jobs that we identified as being below the salary range minimum. These are positions that we'll recommend that be brought up to the minimum. Those are the jobs that we think you're at risk of pay, risk of losing due to pay. Probably the other thing that might be helpful to point out here is that if you look at this chart, and we said our recommendation is going to be to bring anyone below the minimum up to the minimum, you can see that there's going to be a lot of compression between that salary grade minimum and the midpoint. So we don't have any specific recommendations today related to those compression issues, but they are highlighted that when you look at something like this, it does jump out that there's not a lot of there's going to be little difference in pay between employees who have been in the role for a number of years and newer employees, especially as new employees come into the structure. Slide 36 is the police structure. So you can see that as the ranges have shifted, that there's a number of employees, most of the employees do fall below the salary range minimum. And then for the fire structure, not as many employees below the range minimum here, but there are a handful. And again, start to see some of that compression where a lot of the employees are congregated below the range, between the range minimum and the range midpoint. And then the last one with the executive structure. So not a lot of jobs here, but as we've slotted them in, there's a few positions that will be below the salary range minimum. This slide quickly just introduces a definition that we use in the compensation industry. So comp ratio is the comparison of an employee's salary divided by that market benchmark, which again, here we're talking about the market 75th percentile. So if an employee's comp ratio is 100%, that means that they're paid exactly at that market benchmark. So you're going to expect that there's going to be some variability above or below based on the time in the role, experience, performance, those type of things. So it's a matter of scale, but that's just to introduce some of what you see on this next slide. So here we have documented at a high level the cost to implement based on the different market benchmarks. So we compared salaries at the market 50th percentile, that's where half pay more, half pay less. The market 65th percentile and the 75th. So the 75th is where 25% of the organizations pay above that amount, 75% pay less. So as we looked at those different scenarios, we captured some items. So employees below the salary range minimum. At the 50th percentile, there was 38, it goes up to 46, and then 65 at the 75th percentile. There's a few different costs to implementing these structures. So the first is bringing employees to that range minimum. The second is with those step structures, employees need to be placed into a step. And so there's a rounding process where employees round up to that nearest step. And then we have the total. And so you can see that there's some odd dynamics where, as you move up the different percentiles, that cost to minimum goes up, but the rounding goes down. And so they somewhat offset. So the total implementation cost at the market 50th percentile would be $388,419. At the 65th percentile, $412,000, and at the 75th percentile, $419,000. As a percentage of payroll, we have that captured at the bottom. So it's between 2.8 and 3%, depending on the scenario. And then we have the comp ratios listed as well. So this is really the measure of, based on that benchmark, how competitive are the salaries compared to that. So at the 50th percentile, you're at 94.3%, so that's 5.7% below market. That drops as we compare it to those higher numbers, so it goes to 89.4 and 86.2. Again, 100% is going to be paid exactly at that market benchmark. The next slide, and apologies for the small font. We're looking at the different scenarios, but digging into a little bit more detail. So based on department, we're just showing where those costs fall. So you can see that, in some of the departments, there's more costs than others, both in absolute dollars or as a percentage of payroll. And the next slide is where we get into benefits. And Mayor, I apologize, we don't have the detailed benefits slide in here, but I can give some context to that. As we compare to those different cost elements, this slide just shows the relationship on where you're low to the market versus where you're high to the market. So as we saw in some of those earlier slides, base salary, total cash compensation, you're behind market on those, not a big difference between those. As we look specifically at benefits, we show those above market. That's a smaller piece of the pie, but just based on that category, it's above market. And we're still trying to dig into some of that, so we followed up to get additional details from the participating organizations to dig in. One of the areas where we showed that the city was high to market was retirement benefits, which just intuitively doesn't make a lot of sense, so we're still trying to dig in why. Most of the peers are going to have a loggers plan. They're going to offer a similar retirement package. There's some variability, but not to the scale that our analysis was showing. From the medical standpoint, we feel pretty good about that benchmarking. It's a little bit more straightforward. That was really at market, within 5%. I can't remember if it was above or below, but it was pretty close to market. It was primarily in the retirement benefits where we were showing much higher costs within the city compared to the peer group. And then again, as we add that all up, even with the higher benefits that we're showing here, that there probably needs to be more context behind, it's not enough to bring it fully to that market 75th percentile level. After this, I'm going to recap some recommendations. So is there any questions about any of these slides or even the methodology or how we got here before we move on to the next section? All right. So I've already shared this. The first recommendation that we would have is to increase compensation for any employee that were shown below the range minimum. So again, those are employees we think are at risk of losing due to pay. And we would recommend that the implementation be completed, across the board. And so if you target by department or something like that, you can run into some issues based on, it's better to just do it across the board. Another recommendation we did, and I don't know if I had it charted in here, but we did identify a few employees above the salary range maximums. For those employees, we would recommend that pay be frozen until the point at which the market data catches up and they would be eligible for an increase again. We would not recommend bringing pay down. Have here on this first bullet at the top to consider those compression-based pay increases. So I think we don't have any numbers or anything we're seeking approval for today, but as some of the ordinances and recommendations that follow, compression might come up again. And so we did see on some of those charts that there are some compression issues, and so it might be something to look at as a next step. We also recommend to adjust the structures annually. So, this is at a point in time, the market's going to continue to move, and so we'll provide salary structure update letters that document what other organizations are budgeting for their salary increase process and what they're budgeting to adjust their salary structures. That way, the range minimums remain competitive to the market and the range maximums are appropriate. And have a few minutes for questions. I think we're trying to get done by 6, so any questions as we breeze through that?
Honorable Mayor and Council, the next step would be to provide you with an ordinance on your January 28th agenda that modifies the staffing pattern to the 75th percentile is very likely what I'll be recommending to you. The intention as far as dealing with compression issues, we will do that on a case-by-case basis. We'll encourage employees to reach out to the Human Resources Director. And the reason I say that is because it's so difficult to establish a policy when you're talking about compression issues. Good example being that an individual that has been here, let's say one has been here 6 years, the other has been here 12 years. And we move the max out, or the top of the range. So both of those individuals will be topped out. One would be topped out for 1 year, one would be topped out for about 5 or 6 years. So how do you make that a fair and equitable situation? I think that the only way of doing that is on a case-by-case basis, trying to analyze what's most fair and working through that. So that would be the intention of how we will address compression type of issues.
And then at some point in time, well, I apologize, go ahead.
Okay. So we already have a budget, but we know that there's going to have to be some kind of adjustment. And so how are we going to handle that? I'm assuming that it's along the lines of the numbers that were provided in here.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Paulette, the intention would be, we recognize that we were going to have this project when we went through the budget process. And so, especially for Prop P funding, we did not allocate all of the funding that was available so that we would have a budget that could absorb that amount. And that's the case for the general fund as well. So we knew that this was going to occur. We knew that we were lagging. The only question was how far behind the market were we lagging. And we had a strategy of not allocating all of the funding that was available because this project was moving forward.
And then as part of the process, when we're going to have the salary adjustments, someone is coming back to us with the impact to the pension plans then.
Honorable Mayor, once the council makes a decision regarding where you want the staff slotted, the next step after that will be to evaluate the impacts to the pension fund. So as you know, that's a broader issue because we're looking at both, not just how this adjustment would impact it, but what is the amount that we should be contributing to catch up, for lack of a better word. And so we will provide you with options for funding the pension fund at 80%, 85%, 90%, and 95%. It's rare that any pension fund, although I understand the pension board would ideally like it, but it's rare that any pension fund is funded at 100%.
Jim, Stacy,
Is this something that can be done, or have you seen other cities do it all at one time, or do they implement it over a process of stepping it up over a period of time to get to that point?
Yeah, we see both. So it's really based on the, what's in the budget and the affordability to absorb what we're recommending. In some cases, it's a multi-step thing where you might get the increases to minimum and address the compression later. In some cases, it's a matter, we can talk through implementation scenarios to say if we can't afford it, we can help design a way either multi-year or through structure adjustments to make it more affordable.
Any other questions or comments? To Joe and Taylor, thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry. Wayne.
Just a quick one, and that is, I know you mentioned retirement is above the market, but would it matter if we brought medical up to market? I mean, I think you said it right now was that it was maybe below 5%. I don't know.
It's competitive.
Is it?
Yeah,
It is.
and there's
Okay.
difficulties and between prescription copays and there's a lot of gives and takes, and so we're still looking into it. There wasn't anything immediately that would say this needs to be addressed. I think there's always opportunities with those programs to make adjustments and tweaks, but nothing that would say you have to reinvent the wheel.
Thank you very much to Joe and to Taylor, and I would welcome a motion to go into closed session. Motion by for legal actions, causes of action, or litigation involving public governmental body. Ms. Carr made a motion. Mr. Hale seconded. A roll call vote. Ms. Reese.
Councilmember McMahon.
Aye.
Councilmember Hales.
Aye.
Councilmember Cusick.
Aye.
Councilmember Smotherson.
Aye.
Councilmember Clay.
Aye.
Councilmember Carr.
Aye.
Mayor Crowe.
Aye. Thank you very much to those folks who are in the audience. We will be back up right around 6:30 to start the public portion of our meeting.